There's a branch that comes down here called the buccal nerve. Okay, the buccal nerve is sensory, and it goes on the side of buccinator there and goes out into the cheek. Here is the inferior, the lingual nerve. This lingual nerve is going to go down. It's going into the tongue, providing sensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Here's the inferior alveolar nerve, sort of chopped away there. We'll see it in a few minutes. And it comes down and goes into the body of the mandible, travels along, provides sensation to all these lower teeth here, and then changes names, calls itself the mental nerve as it pops out on the other side. Coming off of the inferior alveolar nerve is this little tiny nerve that goes down through that thing called the mylohyoid groove, and is called the nerve to mylohyoid, and it's actually going down to the mylohyoid right down there. Coming into the back of this lingual nerve is a branch of cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve that you heard about earlier. It's carrying taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and also carrying parasympathetics to this submandibular ganglion, where the preganglionics are going to synapse, and the postganglionics are going to go to this thing, the big submandibular gland that you saw, and then there's another gland running along here, the sublingual gland. This whole thing is not really a part of V3. It's a part of the facial nerve, and this little chorda tympani attaches into the back of the lingual nerve here. And then another nerve coming back here, the auriculotemporal nerve, which comes out again with V3 up here and does this really cool thing. It runs into this little artery here, which we'll see in a minute, and instead of going one side or the other, it forms a little loop and then continues on and goes further. We'll see, should have a blow up of it in a minute. Okay. So here's V3. Okay, here's V3. Here's the motor part of V3, the sensory part of V3. The motor part of V3 sends motor fibers to all of these chewing muscles we've talked about. Back here, okay, we have the 7th cranial nerve coming in, and here's your chorda tympani, which goes over the top of the tympanic membrane. That's your eardrum there. That's why it's called the chorda tympani. Comes down and slides into the back of this lingual nerve here. Okay, I talked about the auriculotemporal nerve, which is sensory to the temporomandibular joint and is actually going back to the tympanic membrane. Don't confuse that with something we saw earlier, the great auricular nerve, which was that part of the cervical plexus, right, that goes up with the external jugular towards the ear. Okay, most of what you're going to be finding today is also branches of the maxillary artery, which largely fills this area. So let's go over it again. There's our lateral pterygoid plate, the palatine bone, the back of the maxilla, the pterygomaxillary fissure opening into this pterygopalatine fossa. We've shown that. Okay. So here's the external carotid. The external carotid comes up, gives off, superior thyroid, lingual, facial, some branches going to the back. And then as it basically winds up, gives rise to the superficial temporal artery, which many of you dug out the other day. And right at that junction, it gives rise to the maxillary artery, which everyone's asked, where do I find the maxillary artery? And the answer is in the infratemporal fossa. So there are lots of branches of this that you should be able to find. There are branches going under the temporalis muscle, which are deep temporal arteries. There's an inferior alveolar artery that's going with the inferior alveolar nerve down into the body of the mandible, and it's going to pop out as the mental artery with the mental nerve on the front. As with the nerve, coming off of the inferior alveolar artery is a little tiny artery that's going down to the mylohyoid, to the under part of the jaw. Coming forward, there are these deep temporals. Continuing further forward, as I said, the maxillary artery is not just going to do this stuff in the infratemporal fossa, but the branches of it are hitting out and going into parts of the face and the nasal region and the orbit. The ones you should be able to find, there's an infratemporal artery that's going to come up here, infraorbital artery, going to come up here and travel basically under the orbit, send some little branches down to the upper teeth. And then there's a branch that's coming into the back of the maxilla there, which is the posterior superior alveolar artery. It goes into a little hole there and supplies blood to the upper teeth. So here are some of the branches of the maxillary artery. There are more. Coming off further towards the back is something called the middle meningeal artery. You remember when we opened up the cranium, there were all these branching patterns going on the inside of the skull. That's the middle meningeal artery. It's going up and supplying blood to the meninges, particularly the dura, that's lining the cranial cavity. As this middle meningeal artery goes up through this hole, the stylomastoid foramen, this auriculotemporal nerve that I told you about loops around it. So if you dig deep into here, you should be able to find that little nerve wrapping around the little artery. Okay, moving further forward, there is the sphenopalatine artery, which we've been sort of leading up to. So it goes into this pterygopalatine fossa, then goes through the sphenopalatine foramen and ends up supplying blood to the inside of the nasal region. And everybody, I'm sure, is quite aware, if you've ever had a nosebleed or seen one, that there's a lot of blood on the inside of the nasal region because it has to warm air as you're breathing. Other branches are going to come down and go into the palate and various other parts of the facial region that we'll talk about. But the last branches that you should be able to see is it starts right up here, right behind the ramus of the mandible, gives rise to all these temporal branches, gives rise to this middle meningeal branch, gives rise to branches to all the chewing muscles, and then at the far end of this infratemporal fossa, you should see a branch going up there, which is the diving into the pterygopalatine fossa, and then little branches going into the back of the maxilla. Here's more views of the same thing. The point is, when you get into this infratemporal fossa, there's a lot going on. So be very careful and try to dig out as many of these as you can. Here's the ones we're going to be interested in. Okay, so you should be able to find the inferior alveolar. It's going with the inferior alveolar nerve. You might find, well, that's a branch going into the masseter. It's a branch going into the cheek region. Here's one going into the back of the maxilla. It's going to supply the upper teeth. Deep temporal branches going into the temporalis and that middle meningeal. The front stuff you won't see. You might see it disappearing up there, but we will see these again later when we do the nasal region and the front of the face. It all seems fairly straightforward. Unfortunately, so the maxillary artery is doing lots and lots of stuff. It's supplying, everything from the muscles of mastication forward, basically, particularly on the inside of all these areas. The problem is, all this is taking place in the midst of the lateral pterygoid muscle. And there's no really, normally The maxillary artery is lateral, should be lateral, and then dives in. But the relationship between the maxillary artery and its branches and the lateral pterygoid muscle are just all over the place. So basically what you have to do is you find your artery and pick away the bits of muscle that are in the way so that you can trace the artery, the branches of the artery, because it's going to be intertwined in the parts of the lateral pterygoid. Just realize, although you probably won't see much of it, we talked about the maxillary artery being in here. In this same region, there is a big plexus of veins known as the pterygoid plexus. Okay, it's an important structure, particularly because it has connections to various parts of the face and the neck. So it's a way of infection spreading into the brain and into the cranial cavity. But realize there's lots and lots of networks of veins. Okay, today's dissection. While you were sleeping, Danny was down there buzzing the top off of the brain cases of your cadavers. So when you come in, you will see that there's a line across there. We're going to pop the tops off of the cadavers and get your instructors to grab an instructor, and we will remove the brains, cutting the stumps of the cranial nerves. Because if you just sort of grab the brain and pull it up, you might not find about half the cranial nerves. They could either be broken off the brain or broken off the foramen. So we're going to gently cut them up. You've got to cut some of the